from slave to titan, the banker who bought his freedom. The year is 349 BCE. In a courtroom in Athens, a man named Apollodorus stands before the jurors, accusing his stepfather of embezzlement. The stepfather, Phormion, cannot speak proper Greek. He was born a slave, a barbarian, and though he now holds Athenian citizenship, the language still trips his tongue. Friends speak on his behalf. The case hinges on money, 80 talents, $6 million in modern terms. The speech survives. We can read it. We can trace the arguments, the accusations, the defense. Demosthenes wrote it, the greatest orator in Athens, hired to defend a former slave against the son of his former master. And in those words, preserved on papyrus and stone, we see something the Mesopotamian tablets hinted at, but never fully revealed. Wealth has no memory of where you came from, only of what you can become. The man at the center of this lawsuit was already dead. His name was Pasion, and his story is the most remarkable example of economic mobility in the ancient world. Not because he was lucky, not because he was born to the right family or given royal gifts, but because he built a fortune from nothing, one transaction at a time, until Athens had no choice but to make him a citizen. This is not a story about dynasties, it is a story about leverage. Pasion was born sometime before 430 BCE. We do not know where. Syria, probably. The Levant. Around 440 BCE, vast numbers of Syrian slaves were funneled through Phoenician ports at Tyre and Sidon, sold into Greek households, scattered across the Mediterranean. Pasion was one of them. He arrived in Athens as property, owned by two bankers, Antisthenes and Archestratus, who ran a trapeza, a banking table, at Piraeus, the harbour 5 miles from the city centre. Piraeus was where money moved, ships docked, cargo unloaded, merchants needed currency exchanged, loans arranged, letters of credit issued. The trapeza was the nerve centre of maritime finance, and Pasion, a slave, worked the money-changing table. His title was Argyromoibos, chief clerk. He handled coins, he verified weights, he assessed purity, he kept the books, he proved indispensable. By 394 BCE, Antisthenes and Archestratus manumitted him, freed him, granted him metic status, resident alien, the legal category for foreigners living in Athens. This was rare, but not unheard of. Skilled slaves in high-value work could sometimes earn or purchase their freedom. But what happened next was extraordinary. When his former owners retired, they did not sell the bank or pass it to family. They gave it to Pasion. The slave inherited the business. Think about what this means. The trapeza was not just a money-changing table. It was a network. Client relationships built over years. Trust earned transaction by transaction. Letters of credit recognized across the Mediterranean. The infrastructure of Athenian commerce. Antisthenes and Archestratus could have liquidated and walked away. Instead, they handed the operation to the man who had run it from the inside. They understood that the value was not in the furniture or the coins. It was in Pasion's knowledge of the clients, the deals, the risks. The relationships were the asset, and Pasion already controlled them. He took the bank and expanded it. Athenian banking in the 4th century BCE was not deposit banking in the modern sense. The trapezitai, the bankers, did not take savings deposits and lend them out at higher rates. They held money for safekeeping. They facilitated maritime loans. They extended credit to merchants who needed working capital to outfit ships or purchase cargo. They verified the creditworthiness of counterparties. They issued documents that functioned like checks, allowing a merchant in Athens to draw funds from a contact in another city without physically transporting silver. Pasion excelled at this. His credit, according to his son Apollodorus, was good throughout all of Greece. Ships sailed on his endorsement. Merchants trusted his word. He became the largest source of commercial credit in the most commercially active city in the Mediterranean. This was not speculation. This was intermediation. He stood between capital and opportunity, and he took a cut of every deal that passed through his hands. But Pasion understood something deeper. Banking alone has limits. You can only lend as much as your clients trust you with. Your balance sheet is capped by your reputation. To grow beyond that, you need operating businesses. Businesses that generate cash flow independent of credit markets. Businesses that produce goods the state needs. He established a shield factory. Shields. Specifically, hoplite shields. The round wooden shields covered in bronze that Greek infantry carried into battle. Athens was constantly at war. The Peloponnesian War had ended in 404 BCE, but conflict with Sparta continued. Thebes was rising. The city needed shields. Not dozens, thousands. Pasion's factory became one of the largest in Athens. It employed slaves, free workers, skilled craftsmen. It produced shields at scale, and the state was a guaranteed buyer. Unlike the bank, which depended on maritime commerce and the vagaries of trade, the shield factory depended on war. And in 4th century Greece, war was constant. This was diversification. The bank generated high returns but required trust and liquidity. The factory generated steady cash flow but required capital investment and labor management. Together, they formed a machine. The bank financed commerce. The factory supplied the state. Pasion stood at the intersection, extracting value from both. He understood the importance of public gifts, eugotism, benefaction, the practice of wealthy men making donations to the city. It was expected. It was how you signaled wealth, loyalty, and civic virtue. It was also how you bought political capital. Pasion gifted Athens 1,000 shields, a full hoplite, regiment's worth. He also gifted a trireme, a warship, the backbone of Athenian naval power. Triremes were expensive. Building one cost about a talent, roughly a year's wages for 170 skilled workers. Pasion gave the city a warship. These were not acts of generosity. They were investments. The gifts demonstrated that Pasion had resources. They demonstrated loyalty. They demonstrated that he understood how Athens worked. Wealth without citizenship was precarious. You could be taxed arbitrarily. You had no legal standing in disputes with citizens. You could not own land. Pasion needed citizenship. The gifts were the price. Sometime between 380 and 376 BCE, Athens granted Pasion citizenship. This was almost unprecedented. Citizenship was hereditary, passed through blood. Foreigners, no matter how wealthy or useful, remained metics. Granting citizenship to a freed slave was a rupture in the social order. But Pasion had made himself necessary. The city needed his bank. The city needed his shields. The city needed his ships. And so the city made him a citizen. With citizenship came the ability to own land. Pasion began investing in real estate. Land was the ultimate store of value in the ancient world. It could not be destroyed. It could not be debased. It generated rents. It conferred status. Pasion accumulated property, diversifying out of banking and manufacturing into agriculture and urban rents. By the time of his death in 370 BCE, Pasion had accumulated around 80 talents. In modern purchasing power, somewhere between $6 and $12 million, depending on how you calculate. He was the wealthiest banker in Athens, possibly the wealthiest man in Athens period, excluding those with inherited aristocratic estates. And he had started as a slave. But wealth does not end with its creator. It either perpetuates through structure or it dissipates through heirs. Pasion understood this. He had two sons, Apollodorus and Pasicles, with his wife Archippe. Apollodorus was the elder, but Pasion did not simply leave them the money. He left them a system. Before his death, Pasion leased the bank and the shield factory to Phormion, another slave he had manumitted, who had worked in the bank just as Pasion once had. The lease was structured carefully. Phormion would pay annual rent. He would operate the businesses. And under the terms of Pasion's will, Phormion would marry Archippe, Pasion's widow. This was the pattern in Athenian banking. Bankers married their slaves to their widows after death to keep the bank in the family. The slave, now freed, inherited the operation, but remained bound to the family through marriage. It was a governance structure, a way to ensure continuity without fragmenting the business. Phormion had the operational knowledge. Archippe had the social connections. Together, they preserved the enterprise. Apollodorus resented this. He was Pasion's son. He was a citizen by birth, not manumission. He had inherited wealth, but Phormion controlled the businesses, the bank, the factory, the cash flow. Apollodorus received rents, distributions, gifts, but he did not control the operations. In 350 BCE, Apollodorus sued Phormion, accusing him of embezzling money from the estate. The case is preserved in the speech Demosthenes wrote for the defense, for Phormion. The speech is remarkable. It lays out the entire structure, the lease terms, the annual payments, the division of assets, the marriage arrangement. It argues that Apollodorus has been paid everything he was owed, and that his lawsuit is vexatious, motivated by resentment rather than legitimate grievance. Phormion won. The court sided with the former slave against the citizen heir. Phormion went on to manage the bank successfully for years. Like Pasion, he was eventually granted Athenian citizenship. The pattern repeated. Slave to freedman to citizen. Operational excellence rewarded with legal status. What does this tell us? First, that Athens, for all its talk of democracy and citizenship as sacred, understood the value of competence. Pasion and Phormion were not citizens by blood. They were citizens by utility. The city needed what they provided: banking, manufacturing, ships, shields. When the choice was between ideological purity and economic function, Athens chose function. Second, that wealth built through operations is more durable than wealth built through speculation. Pasion did not get rich trading commodities or betting on wars. He got rich by facilitating thousands of small transactions, each one generating a fee, a spread, a commission, compounded over decades. The bank and the factory were systems. They produced cash flow, whether Pasion was personally involved or not. That is what allowed him to step back, lease the operations to Phormion, and focus on real estate. Third, that manumission was not charity. It was a business model. Antisthenes and Archestratus freed Pasion and gave him the bank because it was the best way to preserve the value they had built. Pasion freed Phormion and structured the inheritance to include him because it was the best way to preserve what Pasion had built. The freed slaves were not just employees, they were successors, tested, trained, trusted. This was talent development at the highest level. Fourth, that citizenship can be purchased, but the price is contribution, not just cash. Passion gave shields and ships. He made the city militarily stronger. The gifts were not bribes, they were proof of alignment. They signaled that Passion's interests were Athens' interests. That made him safe to enfranchise. Fifth, that documentation matters. The lawsuit between Apollodorus and Phormio was possible because the lease was written down. The terms were specified. Witnesses testified. Accounts were reconciled. The speech survives because it was preserved, copied, studied. We know more about Passion's business structure than we know about most ancient figures because he operated in a legal system that required written contracts and produced court records. Compare Pasion to the Mesopotamian families. The Egibes, the Murashus, the Ea Ilutabani all left archives, thousands of tablets. But those tablets are business records, receipts, invoices, lists. Pasion left something different. He left speeches, narratives, arguments about what the business was, how it should operate, who deserved what. The speeches are primary sources written by people who knew him, who worked with him, who fought over his money. They are not descriptions. They are evidence presented under oath in front of jurors who could impose penalties for lying. This gives us texture. The Mesopotamian archives tell us what happened. Pasion's speeches tell us why. They tell us about the tensions, the resentments, the calculations. Apollodorus thought he deserved control because he was the son. Phormio thought he deserved control because he ran the operations. Demosthenes argued that operations trump blood. The court agreed. That is the lesson. Control follows competence. Pasion controlled the bank because he knew the clients and understood the risks. Phormio controlled it after Pasion because he had learned from Pasion and could execute the same functions. Apollodorus inherited wealth, but not control. He got the distributions, but not the decisions. That is what frustrated him. That is what drove the lawsuit. It is also what preserved the fortune. If Apollodorus had controlled the operations, he might have destroyed them. He was a politician, a litigant, a man obsessed with status. The businesses required patience, relationships, discretion. Phormio had those qualities. Pasion had recognized that. The will reflected that. This is the architecture of durable wealth. Separate ownership from operations. Leave the operations to people who understand them. Tie their incentives to long-term performance. Document everything. And use the law to enforce agreements when family sentiment fails. Pasion also understood geographic and sector diversification. The bank was tied to maritime trade. The shield factory was tied to state contracts. The real estate was tied to Athenian land values. No single shock could wipe him out. A collapse in trade hurt the bank, but not the factory or the land. A collapse in state finances hurt the factory, but not the bank. A collapse in land values hurt his real estate, but not his operating businesses. This was modern portfolio theory in 380 BCE. The trapeza itself was a study in risk management. Athenian bankers did not lend their own capital long-term. They facilitated loans between parties. They earned fees for introductions, for guarantees, for documentation. They held deposits for safekeeping and charged for the service. The model was asset-light. Pasion did not need vast reserves. He needed information, relationships, and credibility. Those were assets that scaled without capital requirements. This is why Pasion's story matters. He did not inherit land. He did not receive royal gifts. He did not marry into wealth. He started as property. He accumulated capital one transaction at a time. He reinvested in operating businesses. He diversified. He bought citizenship through contribution. He structured his estate to survive his death. And it worked. Phormion carried it forward. The bank continued. The factory continued. The wealth persisted. Until, eventually, it did not. Like the Aegibes and the Marashus, Pasion's fortune fades from the record. Apollodorus appears in the historical sources as a litigant and politician in the 340s and 330s. He served as triarch, funding warships. He served as chorigos, funding theatrical productions. He was involved in many lawsuits. He seems to have spent the inheritance on public displays and political ambitions. After his death, the family disappears. This is the pattern. First generation builds. Second generation maintains. Third generation spends. Pasion built. Phormion maintained. Apollodorus spent. Without new talent coming in, without operational discipline, the machine stops producing. The wealth disperses into public life, legal fees, liturgies, consumption. But the model survives. The idea that a slave could become a banker, that a freedman could marry his master's widow and control the business, that competence could be rewarded with citizenship, that documentation and legal structure could preserve wealth across generations. These ideas migrated. They appear in Rome. They appear in medieval Italy. They appear in the structures of modern family offices and private equity firms. Pasion demonstrated something the Mesopotamian families hinted at, but could not fully prove because they were always embedded in existing elite structures. He demonstrated that wealth is not about birth. It is about position, knowledge, and repetition. Position yourself at a transaction point where capital and opportunity meet. Acquire knowledge that others depend on. Repeat the process until the system cannot function without you. Then extract payment for being indispensable. The Aegibes positioned themselves between landowners and the state. The Marashus positioned themselves between Persian landlords and Babylonian farmers. Pasion positioned himself between merchants and capital. All three understood that the money is in the middle. The money is in knowing both sides of the transaction better than either side knows the other. The money is in reducing friction, providing certainty, and taking a cut for doing so. Pasion's Athens is not so different from the modern world. Citizenship is still for sale, though we call it investor visas or golden passports. Operations still matter more than ownership in determining who controls enterprises. Talented employees still become wealthy by demonstrating they are more essential than the people who nominally own the business. Courts still side with competence over sentiment when family disputes reach litigation. The mechanisms evolve. The principles do not. Pasion could not have built his fortune in Sparta. Sparta had no banking. Sparta had no maritime trade. Sparta had no shield factories. Sparta's economy was built on conquered helots working the land. There was no space for a foreign slave to insert himself into a transaction flow and extract value. Athens had that space. Athens needed intermediaries. Athens needed people who could verify credit, facilitate loans, manufacture military equipment and do it at scale. Pasion found the space and filled it. That is what immigrants and outsiders have always done. They find the functions the native elite considers beneath them and turn those functions into fortunes. In Athens, banking was seen as slightly disreputable. Aristocrats did not work for wages. They lived on rents from land. Banking required hands-on management, interaction with merchants, assessment of risk. It required work. Pasion did the work. He became wealthy enough that the aristocrats borrowed from him. This is the final lesson. There is always space at the margins. The elite will never do everything. They will never occupy every niche. There are always transactions they consider too small, too risky, too tedious. That is where fortunes are made. Not at the center, at the margins, in the gaps. Pasion started in the gap. He ended at the center. He started as property. He ended as a citizen. He started as a clerk. He ended as the most important banker in Athens. That transformation did not happen through luck. It happened through system, through decades of small, correct decisions, through understanding that each transaction is a test of trustworthiness and that trustworthiness compounds. The tablets from Mesopotamia tell us this. The speeches from Athens tell us this. The archives from Egypt will tell us this. The principle is universal. Wealth is made at transaction points. Control follows competence. Structure preserves what talent creates. And money has no memory of where you came from, only of what you can become. Pasion became what should have been impossible. And Athens, pragmatic, commercial, democratic Athens, looked at a former slave who financed their trade and supplied their military and said, "Citizen." That is the power of making yourself indispensable. That is how barley became a dynasty in Babylon. That is how wildcats built fortunes in Nippur. That is how a slave became a titan in Athens. The names change. The places change. The centuries change. The mathematics do not.